From a collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Devereaux, The Queen's Latin, or Who Were the Romans? Part 4, The Color of Purple. This is the fourth part of our series asking the question, who were the Romans? And contrasting the answer we get from the historical evidence with the pop cultural image of the Romans as a culturally and ethnically homogeneous society, typically represented with homogeneously white British actors speaking the Queen's Latin with a pronounced insular accent. Last week, we extended our time frame from the Republic to the Empire, looking at the ways in which first Italian and then provincial elites were brought into the Roman elite, both literary and political. We saw that while these elites forcefully adopted a Roman identity, they also kept hold of their own original identities, layering the identities on top of each other, and thus being both Roman and provincial, or both Roman and Italian. Pointedly, we focused on the period up to around 180 BC, the long stretch of Rome's maximum power, wealth, and territorial extent, showing that trying to connect the increasing diversity of the imperial elite to decline makes a catastrophic, century-sized error in chronology. This week, we're going to shift our focus away from the senatorial elite in Rome, though we will still in many cases be dealing with elites, because this is who's likely to have had their appearance recorded, and move out of the city of Rome in order to answer the question that I have already been accused of dodging. What color were the Romans? As we'll see in just a moment, that question is founded on some flawed assumptions, but exploring the very literal meaning of that question can serve as another way of charting kinds of diversity within the Roman world. Were there certain ways for a person to look Roman? We have already addressed religious, linguistic, and cultural variety within the Roman world, and indeed within the Roman citizen body. But if one looked down the street of a Roman town, are we likely to see a relatively homogeneous group of people, similar hair, skin and eye color, height, etc., or a wide range? What color were the Romans? As we're going to see, the answer is most of them. But first, as always, if you like what you are reading here, please share it. If you really like it, you can support me on Patreon. And if you want updates whenever a new post appears, you can click below for email updates or follow me on Twitter at Bret Devereaux for updates as to new posts, as well as my occasional ancient history, foreign policy, or military history musings. Note, this is going to be an image-heavy post, particularly with a lot of Roman artwork. Some of that artwork, as ancient artwork is wont, shows men and women in varying states of undress. I have not used any artwork that shows explicit sex acts, though I do note the existence of such. But there is some nudity. Rome in color. Now, as I go through all of this discussion on ethnicity in the Roman world, I know there is someone, perhaps many someones, insisting that all of these different groups in Italy at least aren't really different, because they are white, or alternately insisting that what I am doing is dodging the question of skin color, by, one assumes, cowardly hiding behind the evidence that it mattered less to the Romans than other distinctions. First off, I want to note that I think this argument begins from a mistaken premise. It is assuming that the divisions we impose today on our culture are fundamentally true in all times and cultures, and so we can impose them on people in the past who may have viewed other categories as more meaningful. This is an error, as it ought to surprise no one that social construction is socially constructed. Shocking, I know. And so the organization of a society, including questions of who belong and social hierarchy, depends on human perception about what is and is not important. Consequently, there is no one system of social hierarchy because each society will view the matter differently. Frankly, in many cases, the view that our categories can be cleanly retrojected into the past clearly comes from the assumption of big, important, biological differences that would somehow make groups today considered white more compatible, even in the deep past when they themselves defined their groups very differently. Or, to put it another way, the emphasis on "were the Romans white" accepts unscientific, garbage, nonsense racial categories as fundamentally true in a way that they simply aren't. The easy Roman integration of North Africa compared to the difficulties of Roman Britain and Germany ought to be fatal to this view in any event. This is not to say that the ancients were unaware that people came in different colors. One striking example is Asclepiades of Samos's poem, roughly 270 BC or so, praising the beauty of a black woman named Didyme. Quote, "Didyme has captured me with her eyes, alas, and I melt like wax before a flame, when I behold her beauty, and if she's black, so what? Coals are too, and yet when we heat them, they glow like rose petals." End quote. Translator Larry Bean from Sententiae Antiquae, which also features the original text and a discussion. It is worth taking a brief aside that even in the early 3rd century BC, "E de Melina," quote, "and if she's black," end quote, was a line that could be put in a poem without a whole lot of other context. The reader is assumed to have no problem creating a mental image of a woman, both Calle, beautiful, and Melina, black. A good reminder that Africans, including those with darker skin, were not new to the Mediterranean, but rather a regular sight in the towns and markets of the ancient Mediterranean. After all, the Mediterranean borders Africa on one side and was in essence not a barrier, but a great highway, knitting together far distant communities in networks of trade, discourse, and warfare. Likewise, even a brief reading of the ethnographically oriented authors in the Greek and Roman literary traditions shows an awareness of different skin colors, though it also shows that such authors were far more interested in customs and religion than skin color. This isn't the place to lay out all of the examples, but Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, an anthology of primary sources in translation. Editors R.F. Kennedy, C.S. Roy, and M.L. Goldman, 2013, has a fairly wide and representative sample. You will find quite a lot of descriptions, some more than a little fanciful or absurd, of clothing, marriage rituals, and burial customs, but only very rarely a comment on the color of the people. They also considered significant chunks of Africa and Asia, at least as far as India, to be as much part of their inhabited world as Europe. Ironically, it was Britain, again, which, being on the wrong side of Okeanos, was conceptually the furthest away in at least some Greek and Roman geographic conceptions. And therein lies a key point. As we've already seen, the Romans found other cultural signifiers, language, citizenship, social organization, more important than skin color in understanding who someone was. Ethnicity, the stock, or people one's ancestors came from, might matter both positively and negatively, but skin color was at most ancillary to that. Recall that in all of the Roman bigotry from last week, we saw several references to clothing, accusations of greed, deceptiveness, debauchery, attacks on religious customs, but only one passing reference to color. Again, this should not be mistaken for modern tolerance. The Romans could be, as we've seen, very bigoted towards other peoples and cultures, but people were far more likely to be described through religion, language, culture, or clothing. The Romans were, after all, the people of the toga. Gens togata, for example, Virgil, Aeneid, section 1, line 282, Martial, Satire 14, line 124. Than by the color of their skin. Indeed, clothing, in particular, was a potent marker of Romanness, and readers from last week may recall that it was the trousers, not the skin, of the Gauls to which the Romans objected when Caesar introduced some into the Senate. Suetonius, The 12 Caesars, section 76, line 2, section 80, line 2. Such uniforms of citizenship matter a great deal, as we'll see in a moment. Consequently, I have to note that as a historian, we ought to take ethnic classifications from the time and place when considering ethnic groups, rather than striving to impose our equally arbitrary classifications. And so, that is what I have endeavored to do so far, focusing on the ethnic, linguistic, and religious distinctions that mattered to the Romans in the 3 previous posts in this series. But we all know there is a certain sort of reader who won't accept any of this if we don't discuss skin color. So, we are going to discuss skin color, though I should note this isn't quite the same thing as discussing race. The question, were the Romans white, is one of those not even wrong questions, because white, non-white was simply not a distinction that very much mattered to the Romans, who after all tended to view many supposedly white people as more distant or foreign to them, for example, Gauls, Britons, Germans, than many people who would be regarded today as non-white, North Africans being the most obvious example. The thing is, while skin tone is a real, physical, biological thing, racial categories are socially constructed, read made up by people, and not fundamentally rooted in the natural world. And different cultures and different times define them differently. Famously, some groups seen as obviously, clearly white today were excluded from narrower definitions even relatively recently in the United States. And so the question, what race were the Romans, is fundamentally flawed because it relies on importing a set of racial categories that the Romans didn't use. But because this is a question people have, we're going to answer it, and so discuss skin color in the Roman Empire, with a particular focus on Roman citizens, because, as we've discussed, that legal status tended to be by far the most important signifier of if one was a Roman or not. Though ironically, as we're going to see, we're going to use all sorts of means to tease out Roman citizens from the towns they live, which have citizen status, to the clothing they wear, to the social strata they are in, to whether or not they happen to be emperor, all of which will serve infinitely better in telling us who is a Roman and who isn't than skin color. Pictures in Pompeii. So, all of that preamble out of the way, we get to the question at hand. What color were the Romans? Most of them. They were most of them. Indeed, surprisingly close to all of them. This is actually one of those questions where we need not guess. We can get a sense of this by looking, for instance, at Roman frescoes, quite a few of which survive. Fresco, technically buon fresco, the form of fresco the Romans paint, is a style of wall painting where the pigment is applied on still wet plaster, so that the pigment mixes with the water in the plaster, and when that water dries, the pigment isn't merely on the plaster, but in the plaster. Consequently, frescoes which end up buried can have their colors very well preserved, and as we'll see, fresco painters can recreate a wide range of skin tones very accurately. Consequently, and I want to stress this, the what color were the Romans isn't a question where we need to guess. We know. They very literally painted us a picture. Naturally, the range of skin tones we might see in fresco is going to vary by place, so I want to start us off as near to Rome as we could get while still having a good, broad sample range to work with. That means we're going to focus on artwork from Pompeii, a town in Campania, south of Rome, which had a whole chunk of Sulla's veterans, Roman citizens all, settled on it in the 80s. Consequently, in terms of population makeup, Pompeii actually makes a pretty solid stand-in for Italy writ large, and we can be sure that essentially all of the free persons in Pompeii, certainly the sort wealthy enough to be commissioning large frescoes, are Roman citizens. So this is all at least art for citizens. Pompeii also gives us a really strong terminus ante quem, the last possible date a thing can be, because Mount Vesuvius utterly annihilated the town and buried it under literal tons of ash and soot in 79 AD. That's also handy for what we're doing. There can be no accusation that these images reflect only the later, more thoroughly blended Roman Empire, because all of them were produced no later than the 1st century. Many are older. All of that actually makes Pompeii a fairly effective stand-in for Roman Italy's skin tone range, as distinct from the wider range of the entire empire. Which is in turn valuable because Pompeii's evidence base is so robust as a result of the circumstances of the city's aforementioned destruction by Vulcan. So to repeat, for this section, all of these images are from Roman Italy no later than 79 AD. All of that said, picture time with Dr. Devereaux. Image: trio of Pompeian frescoes showing a range of scenes. Image description: all images in the public domain via Wikimedia Commons. From left to right, a scene of the marriage of Venus and Mars from the House of Solace in Pompeii, a scene of Hippolytus and Phaedra, and a Roman banquet scene also from Pompeii, but now in the Museo Archeologico Nazionale. Being Pompeii, all frescoes date before 79 AD. As an aside, note in the banquet scene, viewable more closely here, how class and color interact. Some of the enslaved servants here, especially bottom center, are notably lighter skinned than the aristocratic family, while another, top second from right, is darker skinned. To the Romans, fair-skinned Gauls and dark-skinned Africans were equally foreign. End of image description. Image: numerous frescoes from Pompeii. Image description: via Wikimedia Commons, the figures of the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries on the outskirts of Pompeii, painted roughly 70 to 60 BC. End of image description. Image: pair of frescoes from Pompeii. Image description: via Wikipedia, a pair of frescoes from the House of the Vetii in Pompeii, completed between roughly 62 and 79 AD. End of image description. Image: fresco from Pompeii. Image description: via Wikipedia, fresco from Pompeii depicting a Roman market. End of image description. One thing you may immediately note is that the women in these scenes are consistently lighter skinned than the men. That's not an accident. Fair skin in women, particularly, was part of the Roman beauty ideal, as it had been for the Greeks. Elite upper-class women weren't supposed to be tan from being out in the sun, and they also used white makeups to make them appear paler, including white lead, what would later be called Venetian ceruse, which was about as healthy as the phrase powdered lead-based cosmetic makes you think it is. Of course, this does not mean that all of the fair skin color up there is nonsense. It is clear there were very fair-skinned Romans. There are some fair-skinned men in there too, but that there were also very tan and olive-skinned Romans, and as we'll see in a moment, also black and brown Romans. But the impact of beauty standards here means that I suspect we ought to take the male skin tones from fresco as a closer indicator of the natural skin color of people in 1st century Roman Italy. Chances are there were just as many tan and olive-skinned Roman women, but that because of the beauty standards, they tended not to be depicted that way in artwork, or tended to be of the sort of social class that didn't get depicted in artwork. I have tried here to be representative of the sampling, though I have also tried to keep the images mostly family-friendly. There is also a large corpus of very sexually explicit fresco from Pompeii, which I would note, if anything, shift the balance of skin tones, particularly male skin tones, for the reasons just discussed, somewhat darker than the sample here. A lot more men with fairly deep olive skin, though women remain very fair-skinned. But we can see pretty much the full Mediterranean skin color range here, from very fair skin, especially among women, to fairly deep browns. Going by the Fitzpatrick scale, a standard 6th grade classification of human skin color, we look to have at least one clear example of nearly every point on the range of light to dark human skin tone. In fact, let's take the actual Fitzpatrick scale diagram via Wikipedia and contrast it with swatches of skin color from these frescoes so we can see that. Image: Example of skin tones from fresco compared to the Fitzpatrick scale. Image description. Fitzpatrick scale emojis via Wikipedia. I've done my best to more or less accurately assign these swatches, though getting a nice solid block of color is difficult. If we limit the range to the men in the image, to try to control for the noted Roman fair-skinned beauty standard in women, we end up with about the distribution one would expect in Italy. The whole range is still there, but 3 and 4 are the most common. Both 1 and 6 are rare, but present. I couldn't get good swatches from the enslaved servants in the banquet fresco, but they'd have given us another 1 and a 5 or perhaps 6 as best as I can make out from the fresco. End of image description. And I want to be clear here, if anything, Pompeii should be a relatively more homogeneous, insular sort of town. It isn't the vast world port of Rome or Carthage, and because of Sulla's veteran settlement, its population would have consisted substantially of individuals whose families had Roman citizenship before the social war. Moreover, because Pompeii stops existing, courtesy of the local volcano, quite suddenly in 79 AD, we know we're not viewing the more blended Roman world of the High and Late Empires, but rather a decidedly Italian-Roman milieu. And yet even before we go into the provinces, which we will in just a moment, the skin tone range in Roman Italy is already very wide, even in the first 2 centuries. And that should be no surprise. This is a Mediterranean culture which has been in trade and cultural contact with the rest of the Mediterranean, including Egypt and North Africa, for centuries. It should also, of course, be no surprise to anyone who has been to Italy, or really anywhere on the Mediterranean littoral, and seen the relatively wide range of human pigmentation there now. The color range difference between Mediterranean Europe and Mediterranean Africa has never been particularly vast, because these communities have been in contact with each other since at least the beginning of the Iron Age, if not earlier. The Mediterranean is not a wall, it is a highway, and has been since antiquity. Instead, the idea that there was some firm separation, that Italians were clearly white in a way that, say, North Africans clearly wouldn't have been, is an assumption based on the Atlantic world of the early modern period, not the Mediterranean world of antiquity. The problem with trying to import those modern categories is that the categories themselves, white and non-white, are artificial and only make sense in the context of the social structures that created them. In the Roman milieu, the nonsense of that rigid categorization and the great weight placed upon it is revealed quite clearly by, as we're going to see, fairly significant zones of overlap in terms of skin coloration, and that is before we even get outside of Italy. Faces from the Faiyum and elsewhere. Unsurprisingly, the wide range of appearances we get for Roman citizens increases if we look more broadly at citizens in the empire outside of Italy. As in Italy, preservation makes the effort difficult. The artwork most frequently preserved are sculptures, but while we know that Roman sculptures were painted, often in very bold colors, that paint often doesn't survive, and can't necessarily be confidently reconstructed. Paintings on perishable materials hardly ever survive. Recall that we have a volcano to thank for the finely preserved frescoes above. One exception to this preservation problem is Egypt. The hard, dry climate enables the survival of all sorts of things that simply wouldn't survive anywhere else. One such category of artwork are mummy portraits. Mummy portraits were an Egyptian custom where a portrait of the deceased person being buried was painted on a rectangular board or panel, typically made of wood and placed in the tomb with the body. The practice itself represents an interesting cultural fusion on its own, a blending of Greek and Roman artwork styles with Egyptian burial practices. Beginning in the late 1st century BC, the painting of these portraits runs into the 3rd century AD, a handy date range for our purposes, as it begins at the same time as Roman rule. The figures shown are mostly local elites. Commissioning an artist for this kind of thing required at least some money, after all, though the wide variation in quality suggests that at least a fairly broad range of the elite engaged in this practice, not merely the very richest individuals. Let's take one of these portraits and look at a few of the elements of it. Image: Hawara Mummy Portrait. Image description: via the British Museum, a mummy portrait, inventory EA 74714, roughly 140 to 160 AD, found at Hawara in the Faiyum, Egypt, and now in the British Museum. End of image description. We have what looks to be a man, perhaps in middle age. A few things are notable. First, he wears a white toga, the standard formal Roman folded cloth garment, draped from the left shoulder, and a white tunic with a purple stripe. Two, in fact. The other is concealed beneath the toga. When I show my students this picture, I joke that the man might as well have worn his "I am a Roman citizen" t-shirt. The impact of the clothing here is similarly blunt. While a fellow might wear a toga in a variety of colors for fashion's sake, this solid white toga is the toga virilis, the distinctive formal dress of a Roman citizen. Meanwhile, that purple stripe on his tunic is the angustus clavus, or angusticlavius, literally the narrow stripe. That too was a bit of clothing reserved as a marker of status. Whereas the toga virilis says, "I am a Roman citizen," the angusticlavius says, "I am of the equestrian order." Nothing to do directly with horses by this point, it merely indicates wealth and that the individual isn't involved in politics in Rome. In short then, this man, or more correctly, his surviving family who commissioned the portrait, is telling us in no uncertain terms, "I was a wealthy Roman citizen." I want to stress that point. There was no real distinctive national appearance that indicated a Roman, no particularly Roman hair color or what have you. But there was a distinctive dress that indicated citizenship, which only citizens were entitled to wear and which was so important the Romans went so far as to call themselves the gens togata, the people of the toga. But of course, we can see other things about him. His hairstyle isn't really typical of fashion in Roman Italy. And of course, he has that star diadem, under which he's arranged 3 locks of his hair. That is meant to tell the viewer something too. In this case, it is meant to tell us that this man is associated with the cult of Serapis, probably a priest. Serapis emerged as a distinctively Greco-Egyptian fusion deity in Egypt in the 3rd century, promoted by the Ptolemaic dynasty in an effort to forge some common ground in their kingdom between Greek and Egyptian subjects. Serapis was worshipped as an aspect of Osiris, merged with the bull Apis. This is, to put it mildly, not a Roman god, though the worship of Serapis spread through the Roman Empire from Egypt, though it doesn't seem to have lost its Egyptian connotations. So our fellow is also telling us, just as clearly, I was an important practitioner of an Egyptian religion, keeping in mind that this fellow lived in Egypt. This is a good example of identities layering, rather than obliterating each other. Visually, the artist and the deceased family have chosen to convey both that this man was Roman and that he was Egyptian, or at least Greco-Egyptian. But of course, that fact about clothing is really very handy for us if we want images from the provinces in color, where we can know with a high degree of certainty that the subjects are Roman citizens, since anyone wearing either the toga virilis or a tunic with that clavus is declaring their citizenship, in a way that would get them in rather a lot of trouble if they were lying. And it turns out there are around 900 of these mummy portraits from all over Egypt. So, what do our Romans in Egypt look like? Well, image: collage of different mummy portraits. Image description: all via the British Museum. These mummy portraits are, top row, starting from the left, inventory EA 74715, dated 100 to 120 AD, EA 74718, dated 80 to 100 AD, EA 74704, dated 150 to 170 AD, all from Hawara in the Faiyum, Egypt. Bottom row, from the left, EA 63396, early 2nd century, from Rubaiyat, Egypt. EA 63396, early 2nd century, from Rubaiyat, Egypt. And EA 74707, 70 to 120 AD, from Hawara in the Faiyum, Egypt. All 6 are now in the British Museum. End of image description. If your mental image of Romans for the Roman Empire doesn't include these 6 fine gentlemen, Update your priors. But it is also worth noting the variety we have here. Even though all 6 of these portraits are from one province in the Roman Empire, Egypt, we have a range of skin tones from fairly light olive to deep browns, and also a range of hair, from straight to curly to very tight curls. But all of these fellows have one thing in common, which is that their dress marks them out as Romans, something they very much wanted you to know. Now, mummy portraits weren't only for men, but assessing the status of women in these portraits is tricky. Women's tunics could also sport clavi, and in a wider range of colors, but these patterns didn't have the same clear "I am a citizen" message as the man's white tunic with purple clavi with toga virilis, and so it can be hard to gauge citizenship status simply from a woman's clothing. That said, the style was a Roman fashion, not an Egyptian one, to my knowledge, so at the very least we may say, and indeed others have said, that the women of many of the mummy portraits from the Roman period in Egypt are wearing Roman-style dress, although often with local touches. Some examples. Image: collage of mummy portraits of women. Image description: all via the British Museum. These mummy portraits are, top, from left, EA 74706, 100 to 120, EA 74712, 100 to 120, EA 74716, 55 to 70, bottom, from left, EA 74713, 55 to 70, EA 74710, 160 to 180, EA 63395, 100 to 120. All are from Hawara in the Faiyum, except for the last, which is from Rubaiyat. All now in the British Museum. End of image description. Again, we can see here a wide range of skin colors, from the fashionably, for the Romans, fair-skinned, top center, bottom left, to darker, and probably truer to life in many cases, skin tones. These are upper-class ladies, and so their portraits show a conscious effort to display wealth, like the expensive perfume bottle that the lady in the bottom right carries, or the heavy use of purple dyed cloth, and also their fashion sense, which mirrors the fashions of the Italian Roman elite quite heavily. Again, we can't know these women's status from looking at their clothing. Besides that, they are clearly fairly wealthy elites. But the fact that clear displays of citizen status are so common among the men buried in the same condition, men of the same social milieu, who may well be these women's fathers, brothers, sons, or husbands, strongly suggests that most of these are provincial citizen women. At the very least, we may say for certain that they are all interacting quite a lot with the broader Roman world and its trends. Moving out of Egypt, our evidence thins greatly, but there are still some things we can say. We have evidence of citizen communities in Gaul from a very early point. You will remember Claudius talking about them last week. And it should take relatively little convincing to imagine that Roman citizens native to Gaul, read France, or Britain were likely on the fairer end of the skin color spectrum as what we see here, even if we don't have a lot of surviving artwork from the region to tell us that. Of course, that doesn't mean that all of the residents of Rome's northern provinces were fair-skinned locals either. A Roman woman whose skeleton and grave goods were found buried in York, England, nicknamed the Ivory Bangle Lady after her bracelets, appears to have been of North African extraction, though isotope analysis suggests she spent her childhood in Britain. There is some debate on the validity of the analysis that marks her as North African, but there's no reason to be skeptical about Africans in Roman Britain. The Historia Augusta, SHA, Life of Septimius Severus, section 22, lines 4 to 5. Life of Septimius Severus, section 22, lines 4 to 5, notes one such, an Ethiops in numero militari, at the end of the reign of Septimius Severus, reigned 193 to 211. You'll see that phrase translated as an Ethiopian soldier, but Ethiops was equally a generic way in Latin to refer to someone as being black, regardless of where they came from. Now, the Historia Augusta is often quite unreliable as a source, but the point here isn't the truthfulness of the particular episode, but the fact that a black Roman soldier serving in Roman Britain was, to the author of the Historia Augusta, a perfectly reasonable thing to posit. And of course, the same would be true of Roman soldiers from Gaul, Spain, Italy, or Britain serving in Africa or the East. We'll talk more about the Roman army's role in all of this next week, but in brief, it functioned to move individuals all around the empire as units were transferred from this or that frontier. But back to our portraits. All of these people were Romans. That part of their identity was probably never seriously in doubt. Many of them had likely been Romans for generations. Indeed, we should observe the profundity of what these people and their families, since it was the families that would have commissioned the portrait, as one generally cannot commission artists while dead, reaching through time to convey the essentials of themselves, chose to show us. A great many of them, it seems, put a great deal of effort into communicating to the future that proudest of boasts, Romanus civis fui. I was a Roman citizen. It must have been very important to them to say it. The color of purple. And yet this wide range of skin color is rarely captured by the popular imagination or absorbed by the public, often because it simply does not appear in the materials produced for them. We've beaten up a fair bit here on HBO's Rome. Lest anyone think I am bashing for bash's sake, I will say I actually like HBO's Rome quite a bit. But it is hardly alone. For another example, take the recent project by Daniel Washart to visualize with modern software the faces of the Roman emperors. This project, which I will say I think is quite good, though we are about to point out some flaws, was faded everywhere and shot all around the internet. Image: Portraits of Roman Emperors by Daniel Washart. Image description: a set of portraits of the Roman emperors as originally released by Daniel Washart. Please note that Washart subsequently reissued this chart with darker skin tones for some of the emperors, notably the Severans. That said, I have never seen the corrected version, which I'd argue is probably still too fair on the average, in the wild on the internet, whereas I continue to see the uncorrected version shared and disseminated. End of image description. And I do mean everywhere. Here it is at The Verge and Smithsonian Magazine, mercifully using the 2.0 versions of the portraits, and Popular Mechanics, and also a 30-minute YouTube video by the World History Encyclopedia, which, by the by, is not a good or reliable website, despite its popularity with students. Wikipedia is honestly better. Pointing out some of the serious errors in their articles could be a blog on its own, for there are many. And it was all over social media, which is a real issue because the original set of portraits were so badly flawed, they had to be reissued. And even then, I think there are serious problems in how the skin color of these emperors is reconstructed. And I want to note at the outset that I am also not here to bury this chart, nor its creator. This was not a fundamentally flawed project, and I don't mean to imply that it is. Merely that the sort of errors it fell into, particularly in its 1.0 version, speak to the pervasiveness of the problem we have been talking about. Because this chart assumes, unless otherwise indicated, and sometimes even when otherwise indicated, that Roman emperors were essentially white, and very white in most cases, as its baseline assumption. Now, to his credit, Daniel Washart reissued the chart after getting some criticism of some of the portraits which darkened some of the skin colors used, though the treatment was applied only to specific emperors, not generally. Whereas I might have suggested that systemic errors require systemic solutions. Moreover, and Washart can hardly be faulted for this, the reissued chart made much less of a splash and spread over the internet quite a bit less than the original, making this an instance where Washart is both innocent victim of the whitening of Rome in the popular culture and an accidental purveyor of the same. To be clear, I am not faulting Washart. It seems to me a rather difficult and big thing to admit the mistake and change the chart, and I respect the honesty to do that openly. He seems to be doing his best, and nothing is perfect on the first run. But I do want to interrogate the mistakes that led to the first problem chart, some of which remain in the reissue. Image: Daniel Wachart's second Roman Emperor chart. Image description: the reissued version of Daniel Wachart's chart, available as a fancy print via his Medium post here. While I still have substantial issues with the reconstruction here, I think the whole thing could probably be improved by shifting effectively all of the portraits one notch higher on the Fitzpatrick scale, with just a few exceptions for emperors we know were explicitly fair-skinned. As it goes, this chart is the best of its kind currently available, and Wachart is to be applauded for it. End of image description. I think we can see a trend in the thinking here with the very first portrait of Augustus blown up a bit from the chart. Image: portrait of Augustus from the first Wachart chart. Image description: Augustus from the original issue of Wachart's chart. His 2.0 version is slightly less blonde, but only slightly. End of image description. Now, what do we know about how Augustus looked? Well, we have a lot of sculpture, and Wachart has done an excellent job with his software in capturing the structure of the face we see in statues of Augustus. One thing I was made to learn as part of my MA was the ability to recognize the first 18 or so emperors on sight, a thing you can do if you know Roman imperial sculpture well enough. And, absolutely, that's Augustus. But of course those sculptures are in marble, and while they would have been painted originally, that paint is now gone. So, how do we interpolate the color of Augustus's skin or hair or eyes? Well, good news. Suetonius essentially tells us. Suetonius, Life of Augustus 79. Wachart has this citation wrong in his notes due to an error in the English transcription on Perseus, for which he can hardly be faulted, though I assume this error is indicative of Wachart's lack of familiarity with the Latin, which is about to matter. That Augustus's hair was leviter inflexum et sufflavum, lightly curly and dirty blonde, and his skin was colorem inter aquilum candidumque, colored between dark and bright, by which we should probably understand tan. But somehow, dirty blonde and tan become, as above, very blonde and quite fair. This particular portrait is almost entirely unchanged in the reissue. The hair is a little darker. That Augustus is colored pretty close to Simon Wood's portrayal of Octavian in HBO's Rome below, except that Simon Woods is an English actor and Octavian was, Italian, and apparently at least a little brown by Italian Roman standards. Image: Simon Woods as Octavian. Image description: from HBO's Rome, Simon Woods playing Octavian. I didn't intend it this way, but the Italian extra standing behind him really just makes the point, doesn't it? End of image description. Language note: this is a case where I think familiarity with Latin matters, because color words are always finicky. The Romans have a word for blonde or golden-haired, and it is flavum. So if hair is subflavum, it isn't blonde, it's quasi-blonde, almost blonde. But dirty blonde is, well, at least a fair bit brown. The reconstruction is really very blonde. Meanwhile, his skin is between aculum, dark, and candidum, white, according to Suetonius. Candidus here is easy. That's very white, like chalk or paper. Here, as a skin tone, I think Fitzpatrick 1 or 2. How dark is aculum? That's more difficult. Aculum is a rare word, but here we have the grammarians to the rescue, particularly Sextus Pompeius Festus, Book 1, Section 1, who notes, quote, Aculus is a color tawny and almost black, end quote. Aculus cula est fuscus et sub niger. Latin niger, for black, has exactly the English cognates you think it does. Aculum is probably around a 5 on the Fitzpatrick scale. So Augustus's skin is somewhere in the middle between very fair, candidum, and almost black, aculum. Probably that's something like a 3 or 4 on the Fitzpatrick scale, but here we've got generously a 2, almost 1. That's simply not what Suetonius's Latin says. The more obvious initial problem was with the version 1.0 of the Severans. That was easily what drew the most immediate criticism, because we have surviving artwork in color of Septimius Severus, here juxtaposed with Vaschart's version 1.0 and version 2.0 depictions of him. Image. Both Vaschart versions of Septimius Severus next to a historical illustration. Image description. Left, version 1.0 of Vaschart's reconstruction of Septimius Severus. Center, via Wikipedia, the Severan Tondo, roughly 199, showing Septimius Severus, his wife Julia Domna, and their sons Caracalla and Geta. Geta's face was blotted out. After Caracalla assassinated his brother, he had his images removed in a damnatio memoriae. Right, version 2.0 of Vaschart's reconstruction. End of image description. Again, good on Vaschart for constructively responding to criticism. But also, it isn't hard to see the problems between the frankly pale original reconstruction and the red-brown contemporary portrait, which is, to be clear, not obscure. It is a famous piece of artwork, and on Wikipedia. Even the reconstructed version doesn't quite catch the hue of the artwork, which I think implies something closer to a Fitzpatrick 5 than what we have, which is perhaps a 3 or maybe a 4. And that dark skin makes a lot of sense. Septimius Severus was born in Leptis Magna, in what is today Libya. His father at least seems to have been of Punic extraction, and so may have been living and marrying in North Africa for centuries. His mother was from an Italian family, but it isn't clear how long they'd been settled in North Africa. How does a glaring error like that get made for an emperor for whom we have a contemporary color painting? I should note that I hardly think the 2 emperors I've focused on here are the only reconstructions which have problems. Just looking at where the skin color of Roman-era Italian artwork clusters suggests to me that nearly all of the Italian-born emperors probably ought to be rather more tan. The problem here is that the reconstructions systematically whitened the emperors, through, I suspect, an error in the software used, which was probably trained primarily on very fair-skinned faces. How does that happen? And more importantly, how does it go so easily unnoticed, both by the creator but also by so many of the early evangelists for the project? The answer, of course, is what we've been talking about all along, the Queen's Latin, the built-in assumption that the Romans, or at least elite Romans, were mostly white and looked a lot and sounded a lot like not just Europeans, but Northwestern Europeans. It is why the notion of a Roman emperor who was not only African but also at least brown, if not black, strikes most people as absurd. But of course, it's true. It's not Septimius Severus who was absurd. It is the Queen's Latin and the vision of Rome it promotes. Also, while we're here, to keep noting the Roman trend in artwork towards lightening the skin of women, Septimius's wife, Julia Domna, pictured above, was a native of Syria, probably of Arab extraction, and so while I cannot be sure, we may suspect that she was not generally so pale. The choice of skin tone may either be the artist trying to be flattering, or it may reflect Julia wearing fashionable skin lightening cosmetics, well attested in ancient sources as something fairly common. Nevertheless, it turns out unrealistic beauty standards are not merely a product of modern mass culture. Septimius Severus was, by the by, hardly the only emperor to hail from outside of Italy, although we have to be careful because some emperors with provincial origins may have come from Roman colonies in the provinces, and thus be perhaps only a generation or 2 removed from the Italian elite. Nevertheless, we know that Trajan was born in Spain, though perhaps descended from Italian colonists. How much intermarrying there would have been there is unclear, as was Hadrian. Didius Julianus, briefly emperor, was born in Cisalpine Gaul, by that time part of Italy. His heritage on his father's side was Gallic, from the Insubri, while his mother was from Hadrumetum, an old Phoenician colony in North Africa. S.H.A. Didius, section 1, line 2. He was a senior senator before briefly being emperor. Septimius was African, as noted, so Geta and Caracalla, his children, were mixed African and Syrian in ancestry. Elagabalus, his nephew, was of Syrian origin, same as Julia Domna, as was Severus Alexander. Maximinius Thrax was, well, a Romanized Thracian, as his name suggests. We needn't believe the predictable slander in our sources, chiefly the Historia Augusta and Herodian, that brand him as a barbarian, but he clearly was from Thrace. The Gordiani, there are 3 of them, seem to have been perhaps Anatolian in origin, being granted citizenship perhaps by Mark Antony, though by the 3rd century that origin may have felt quite distant. Philip the Arab was, well, a Romanized Arab. Sometimes this stuff is easy. And so on and so on. Diocletian was Dalmatian. Constantine was Illyrian through his father, and perhaps Bithynian through his mother. It should be no particular surprise that Roman emperors from outside of Italy begin first slowly, with Spain and North Africa represented first, and then accelerate, particularly after the Constitutio Antoniniana expanded citizenship to all free persons in the empire in 212. That's precisely the same pattern as we saw with senators and literary elites, as the Roman upper crust slowly expanded to encompass a wider range of Romans, both new and old. But that expansion is important for us because it goes right to the question of who was a Roman. By the 190s, not only could a Spaniard, an African, a Gaul be a Roman, they could be the Roman without being meaningfully treated as an outsider. Of the above, only Elagabalus and Maximinus Thrax seem to have been seen as somehow un-Roman by many of their contemporaries. The former for his Syrian religious practices, which seem to have offended Roman sensibilities, and the latter who came up through the army because he never actually visited the city and deeply antagonized the Roman Senate, a mistake which cost him his rule and his life. Would a Roman in any other color? All of which brings us back to the pop cultural representation of the Romans. As we've seen, Romans, both in Italy and beyond it, covered a wide range of physical characteristics. We see fair-haired Romans and dark-haired Romans, Romans with straight hair, curly hair, and hair with tightly coiled curls. We see Romans with very light skin, very dark skin, and every color in between. And this should be no surprise, because Rome was, as we've seen, essentially poised on a crossroad of crossroads, at the center of the great Mediterranean highway. Again, contrast that with the popular image of the Romans. Image: the Roman Senate from HBO's Rome. Image description: the Senate from HBO's Rome. On that same scale above, this is a wall of Fitzpatrick 1 and 2s, despite the fact that, as noted, such fair-skinned men are less common in Roman artwork. End of image description. We can see here quite clearly a few problems. The first is, of course, that we see none of that range of coloration from all of this Roman artwork we've been looking at. These fellows aren't merely fair-skinned, they're uniformly so, which gives the, by now we've seen, wholly incorrect sense of Rome and its Senate as homogeneous institutions, when they weren't. But of course the broader issue is that the Senate here is presented not merely as homogeneous, but as homogeneously white. Now, this is the Senate of the mid-1st century BC, so at this point we ought to expect them to all be Italians, but even by this point, that would suggest a wider range of appearance than this, as we saw above with our Pompeian frescoes. I've seen no indications anywhere that the Roman elite were notably whiter than the common Roman, although that sure does seem to be the impression you'd get from a lot of pop culture depictions of Rome. And there, at least, we come to the real problem with the implication of the Queen's Latin. Visually and orally, it claims the Romans as white. And sure, if you are Spanish or British or German or Italian or French, and you want to claim Roman history as part of your heritage, go right ahead. I will stick to my guns and declare it is still wrong to say anyone in the Roman world was white or non-white in the sense that term is used today. But if you want to say that Roman history is yours because some of the Romans looked like you do, came from the part of the world you do, or your ancestors did, go right ahead. Were there Romans who looked white in today's terminology? Absolutely. But the uniformity of the Queen's Latin and the fierce reflexive outrage whenever it is challenged works to deny other people who trace their roots to Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco or Egypt or Syria or Anatolia or a dozen other places, the ability to say that Roman history is theirs. The Queen's Latin declares, falsely, with the power of the visual medium, that Rome was a white man's empire, reimagining Rome in the shape of the white European colonial empires of the early modern period. Empires we may truly call white because they were empires in which power and full membership was marked out by the color of one's skin and the continent of one's ancestry, in a way that was not true of Rome. Subtly, but consistently, this way of depicting Rome tells those students located in the upper 4/6 of that Fitzpatrick scale, which is, to be clear, most of the scale and most humans. This isn't for you, but it is for them if they want it. Rome is theirs, just as it is yours, just as it is mine. Though there is an excellent chance that a student whose ancestors hailed from Algeria would have a far better claim to Rome as their history than I do. And I want them to come study it with me, because we all, whether our ancestors lived in the Roman Empire or not, our world is built atop the Romans' world, in some places literally, and in some cases figuratively, though it is often the figurative foundations that are the more profound. And if the you who is reading this is that student who wants to claim the Romans, regardless of where you come from, come study Rome with me in whatever capacity you wish. The impression that Rome was merely a white man's empire isn't true to the evidence, and it is both a detriment to our understanding of the past, including our ability to understand societies that value different things than us, and so our ability to understand that we might choose to value different things too. And it is a poison for the study of the ancient world in general and Rome in particular, because we cannot afford to turn away even one eager student. It is long since time we abandoned the Queen's Latin's portrayal of the Roman world in favor of an accurate portrayal of the Roman world, with the helpful but secondary benefit that such a portrayal cannot help but be more welcoming. Were there black and brown Romans? Yes, absolutely, without question. Were there African Romans, Western Asian, or Middle Eastern, if you prefer, Romans? Yes, absolutely, without question. Our evidence on this point is indisputable. The evidence that Rome was a diverse society by essentially any measure is so preposterously strong, consisting of the unanimous testimony of every sort of evidence we have, including the endless complaining of Roman bigots, that it is hard to view the continued popular resistance to this notion, scholarly resistance to this notion, from actual specialists rather than non-specialists straying out of their expertise to try to score political points, is effectively non-existent, because there isn't much evidence to argue from, as anything but stubborn bigotry of its own sort. So let's say it once more, loudly and with feeling for the folks in the back. Rome was diverse. It was ethnically diverse. It was religiously diverse. It was linguistically diverse. It was culturally diverse. And yes, though this mattered much less to the Romans than it seems to matter to us, It was color diverse. And Rome was diverse from the very beginning. Its strength was built on its diversity. Moreover, Rome was not merely diverse in the cheap way that all empires are diverse. The Romans did not merely keep multicolored slaves. Although it is necessary to be honest about the uglier elements of Rome, the Romans did keep many different diverse peoples in cruel bondage. Rather, a great part, perhaps the defining part, of Rome's triumph was in successfully integrating those many diverse peoples into itself, in allowing them to become Roman, to again borrow a phrase from Greg Wolfe, without demanding they lose their own local identities. This sort of diversity was the thing that set Rome apart from its competitors, predecessors and successors, and fundamental to Rome's ability to leave such a strong legacy after its empire began to very slowly crumble. Next week, assuming I can keep up my writing schedule, we'll finish up this series by asking if Roman diversity led to the fall of the empire, as some claim. Spoiler alert, it didn't, but heightened Roman intolerance might have. This has been a recording from a collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Devereaux, recorded by myself, a great divorce, for accessibility and sharing purposes. If you enjoyed this content and wish to engage with it or support Bret, please check the description for links to the original post on his blog, his Twitter, and his Patreon. I highly encourage you to share, support, and engage with his works on any and all platforms if you are so inclined. If you wish to support me, please do remember to like, share, and subscribe to this or any other content here that you enjoy. Thank you so much for listening.